This provides us with a context for the work that we are doing here in the field of intercultural communication. And there are three major principles which have developed over the years since this field has been developing. The last 40 or 50 years, I think, would be a good amount of time for the development of this field. And that the first idea here is the idea of subjective culture. The notion of subjective culture is contrasted to the idea of objective culture. Sometimes this is referred to, objective culture is referred to as culture, as in let's go out and do something cultural tonight, you know, and typically for native speakers anyway, that means going to the opera or going to a lecture on history or some other thing that refers to the institutions of a group, the products that have been created by a group of people. Berger and Luckman, in their book on the social construction of reality, a classic sociology text, call this the institutional level of culture or objective culture. Subjective culture, on the other hand, is that kind of culture which we internalize through those institutions into our everyday worldview. It's not simply everyday behavior. It's not buying bread in the store. It's more the way in which we organize our experience in the world. And each of us in different cultures organizes our experience in some systematically different ways from people of other cultures. Thus, the idea of cultural difference in the subjective sense is not differences of art and architecture and literature and food and so forth, although there are also those differences of objective culture, but also differences in the way in which we organize our perception and we experience the world around us, the way we approach relationships, the way we organize our experience of time, for instance. These kinds of things are part of our subjective worldview, and this worldview is what constitutes subjective culture. This idea is consistent with the original idea of culture, subjective culture, coming from American anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Frank Boas, who developed the idea of cultural worldview to counteract the notion of objective culture as being a mark of greater civilization. Not so long ago, as you know, we spoke of societies that were more cultured or less cultured. And the more cultured societies took it upon themselves to colonize the less cultured societies and bring culture to the less cultured people. Frequently in terms of the barbarians and the savages and the civilized people would be bringing their civilization to the barbarians. This was based on a hierarchical notion of culture that somehow people who had more of certain kinds of this objective culture were therefore more civilized. This idea of creating a hierarchy was then criticized and heavily counteracted by the American anthropologists and as well as European anthropologists who said this does not capture the feeling of equal complexity of human beings. That a human being who is a member of a tribal group has every bit as complex an experience of the world as a human being who belongs to some European aristocracy. That there is no difference in the complexity of experience of the world. And it is that complexity of experience that we refer to as our worldview, our subjective worldview. Thus, cultures became equal to one another. We cannot speak of one group as having more culture than another. Cultures were simply different from one another. This idea became, as you of course can see, an extremely important and central idea to the idea of intercultural communication. That is that we are communicating with one another not from a position of power with one another, although that may be true in terms of the objective culture or institutions. It may well be that one culture continues to have more power than another. In, however, our interpersonal communication around cultural differences, we are emphasizing the interaction of our subjective worldviews And in that sense, we are equal. We are equally complex. And it is coming to that realization, which is the development of intercultural competence. Another implication of subjective culture is that we are constructing the boundaries of culture. What this means is that we cannot argue that there really is or is not a particular culture. We must indeed say that we are in the process of constructing a boundary that generates that culture. Briefly, to give you a small graphic of what that looks like, if this is the set of all human behavior here, the way in which we draw the boundary may be to put a boundary like this, and what the boundary does is to generate an inside condition, let's call it A, as opposed to the outside condition, let's call it not A. Now, inside that boundary, we can put anything. Frequently, we will put a national culture. So we draw the boundary around the political boundaries of a place, and we'll say, okay, that's Germany, and outside of that is not Germany. That's Finland, outside of that is not Finland. Or we could draw the boundary a bit broader and say, this boundary here are Nordic countries, and outside are not Nordic countries. Or we could draw it a bit broader and say, this boundary here is Europe, and outside is not Europe, etc. Or we can become a little more specific and say, inside this boundary is an ethnic group. Lappish people, for instance. Within the boundary of Finnish national boundary, we also can create an ethnic boundary that defines a particular group relative to another. Or men and women, for instance. Or yet another way we can draw the boundary is to say, well, here are two national groups. Let's say one of them is Iraq and one of them is Turkey. And within that group, you have people who consider themselves Iraqis and people who consider themselves Turks. However, across this boundary, you have another group called Kurdish. And in this case, the ethnic group cuts through the national group, and people may well identify more with being Kurdish than with being either Iraqi or Turkish, which is in fact the case. This kind of ethnic boundary, so we can think of this as a national boundary. We can think of this as an ethnic boundary. And we can also think of other sorts of boundaries, gender boundaries, the boundaries of social class, the boundaries of particular interests, such as functions in an organization, engineers, for instance, and so forth. In all cases, the boundary indicates a greater level of interaction within the boundary than outside of the boundary. So Germans, for instance, interact more with other Germans than they do with French people. Typically, this ethnic boundary that cuts across the national groups is a boundary that occurs when the national cultures have been constructed, frequently by colonial powers, and imposed on groups that have other affiliations. So in Africa, for instance, there are many such imposed national boundaries from colonial powers that don't have much to do with people's feeling of what culture they belong to. And so the ethnic boundary becomes the more important boundary compared to the national boundary. Okay. In the United States right now, we have a balance of the ethnic and the national boundary, so that we have people who consider themselves, for instance, African Americans, people of African heritage in general, people of European heritage, European Americans, people of Hispanic or Latino heritage we call Latino Americans, and these people tend to use both terms to refer to themselves. So they would, an African American would say, I'm a person who belongs to the American boundary. I see myself as being inside that boundary, but I also see myself as being inside the boundary of a person of African heritage. And so in that way, I consider myself an African American, somebody who belongs to both boundary conditions. And this is becoming a very common condition in the world now, not just in the United States. And it's called the multi-layered cultural identity. This is probably, and I'm sure that you've heard about this, but this is probably something that will become a more and more important idea as time goes on. The multi-layered cultural identity, multi-level cultural identity. All right. The second principle of intercultural work is interaction analysis. And interaction analysis means that when we are talking about subjective culture, we are not just doing ethnographic description. We're not saying, well, that culture is like that. How about that? This culture is like this. How about that? We're not even saying this culture is like this compared to that culture, which is like that. All of that is important and interesting, but it tends to be either anthropology or comparative education or some other area like that. What is particularly intercultural communication is the analysis of interaction when these culture or people of these cultures come together. This analysis of interaction tends to occur within certain frameworks, and many of you are familiar with these frameworks. They are typically language use, which is how it is that we use language in social context, nonverbal behavior, such as gesturing or eye contact or that sort of thing. Communication style, how we organize our messages, if we go straight to the point, if we talk around the point, if we're low context or high context. If we're direct or indirect, do we speak directly to people's face or do we go around more subtly to other people? Do we confront people intellectually and say, that's a stupid idea, or are we more careful about that? These are all communication style issues. And depending on the cultural difference in communication style, we can analyze the interaction. For instance, if I'm a person who comes directly to the point, and you're a person who speaks around the point, can we predict how we might misunderstand one another? Well, of course we can. The person who comes directly to the point thinks that the person who's talking around the point is what? What do these direct people think that these circular people are doing?
Ambiguous.
Yeah, they're being ambiguous. Maybe they're hiding something. Maybe they're lying to you. So forth. Now, but on the other side, the people who are speaking like this, what do they think about those people who speak like this? They're rude, abrupt, and maybe even arrogant or patronizing, hitting you over the head with a point when you can figure the point out yourself. So we can predict the kind of misunderstanding that's likely to occur by understanding that there are differences in this case of communication style and then analyzing a particular interaction between those styles. Much of intercultural communication is based on that kind of interaction analysis. Finally, we come to the idea of adaptation strategy. And this will be our focus for this morning. The rest of this is just a kind of a background. But the focus, it will be on how do we then use the idea of subjective culture and interaction analysis to move to the ability to behave more appropriately, more effectively in other cultural situations. Another way of saying it is to increase our repertoire of behavior so that we are able to behave in a wider range of situations authentically. That is, we don't stop being who we are, but we attain the ability to extend who we are into ways that are appropriate in a wider range of cultural situations. This is the idea of adaptation. And particularly, and I'll speak about how that works through the development of sensitivity, we particularly are interested, and this is maybe the very leading edge of the field, is we're particularly interested in what happens when people try to adapt to one another. That is, that I am trying to adapt to you, but equally you are trying to adapt to me. That as we come together in our attempts to adapt, and both of us with some level of competence in doing this, perhaps we generate a third culture. We generate a position that is neither more yours nor mine, but a third place which adds to the overall creativity or value of our interaction. This idea of creating a third culture is something that is now rather popular in the intercultural field. Here you see on this graphic the idea of culture A and culture B coming together, not directly together, but coming together within some other cultural context. I say it's an organizational culture, but it might be a national culture or an ethnic culture. And as these two groups come together, they generate this third culture position, and out of the third culture position comes the value to the organization. So for those of you who are working and will be working with multicultural organizations, multicultural teams, things like that, where we say there's a value in the diversity of the multicultural team, what we're saying really is that some new creativity, some new synthesis comes out of people who bring different cultural perspectives. However, what we are learning is that that does not happen automatically. It does not happen simply because cultures are in the same place at the same time. Rather, it happens because there is a competent attempt towards mutual adaptation. A competent attempt at mutual adaptation. That's what generates a third culture, which in turn then feeds creativity into the organization or into the society. Very important idea, and one that will be getting a lot more attention as we move forward.